Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of being more than just a military intelligence analyst. At 28, she possessed an analytical mind that could piece together complex patterns from seemingly unrelated data, but her heart yearned for field operations. When the opportunity arose to join a classified mission in the mountains of Afghanistan, she jumped at the chance, despite the warnings from her colleagues about the dangerous territory they would be entering. The mission briefing had been vague, as most classified operations tend to be. Sarah's role was to analyze intercepted communications and provide real-time intelligence support to a team of Navy SEALs who would be conducting a high-priority extraction. The target was Dr. James Chun, an American scientist who had been captured by a terrorist cell while working on a humanitarian water purification project in a remote village. As Sarah climbed aboard the military helicopter that gray morning, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The aircraft was filled with hardened soldiers, their faces painted with camouflage, weapons secured but ready for action. The team leader, Commander Jake Sullivan, gave her a brief nod of acknowledgement. His reputation preceded him: 15 years of special operations, countless successful missions, and a loyalty to his team that was legendary among the ranks. The flight over the rugged Afghan landscape was breathtaking yet sobering. Below them stretched endless mountains, deep valleys, and remote settlements that seemed untouched by modern civilization. Sarah reviewed her intelligence files one more time, studying satellite images and communication intercepts that had led them to believe Dr. Chun was being held in a compound approximately 50 miles northeast of Kabul. What Sarah didn't know was that their mission had been compromised from the very beginning. 3 weeks earlier, a corrupt intelligence officer had sold information about the operation to the highest bidder. The terrorist cell holding Dr. Chun had been expecting them, and they had prepared an elaborate trap that would test every skill the Navy SEALs possessed. As the helicopter approached the drop zone, Commander Sullivan noticed something was wrong. The landscape below them didn't match the reconnaissance photos they had studied. The compound that should have been visible was nowhere to be seen, and instead, they found themselves flying over a narrow canyon with steep rocky walls on both sides. "This isn't right," Sullivan muttered into his headset, studying the GPS coordinates. "We're in the wrong location." The pilot's voice crackled through the communications system, tense with concern. "Sir, I'm reading multiple heat signatures below us. We've got company." Before anyone could react, the first rocket-propelled grenade streaked past the helicopter's nose, missing by mere feet. The aircraft shuddered as the pilot threw it into an evasive maneuver, but they were trapped in the canyon with limited options for escape. "We're taking fire," the pilot shouted as automatic weapons opened up from concealed positions on the canyon walls. "I've got multiple shooters at 2 o'clock and 10 o'clock. We need to get out of here now." The helicopter lurched violently as bullets struck the fuselage. Sparks flew from damaged equipment, and the acrid smell of smoke began to fill the cabin. Sarah found herself pressed against the wall, her heart pounding as she watched the Navy SEALs spring into action with practiced efficiency. Commander Sullivan was already on the radio, calling for backup and trying to coordinate an extraction, but the interference in the canyon was making communication difficult. The terrorist cell had chosen their ambush point well, knowing that the rocky walls would limit both escape routes and radio contact with outside forces. "Engine 2 is hit," the pilot reported, his voice strained as he fought to maintain control of the damaged aircraft. "We're losing altitude fast. I can't keep us up much longer." The situation deteriorated rapidly as a second RPG found its mark, striking the helicopter's tail rotor. The aircraft began to spin uncontrollably, and Sarah could see the ground rushing up to meet them through the small window. The Navy SEALs were shouting orders to each other, preparing for a crash landing that seemed inevitable. In the chaos that followed, Sarah would later remember fragments of conversation, pieces of a desperate plan being formed in real time. She heard Commander Sullivan speaking urgently into his radio, something about emergency protocols and acceptable losses. The words didn't fully register in her mind at the time, as she was focused on the immediate terror of the spinning helicopter and the approaching canyon floor. What happened next would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. As the helicopter continued its downward spiral, she felt hands grabbing her arms. Before she could process what was happening, She was being pushed toward the open door of the aircraft. The last thing she remembered before falling was seeing Commander Sullivan's face, set in grim determination, and hearing him shout something that sounded like an apology. Sarah Martinez plummeted toward the rocky canyon floor, her mind unable to comprehend how quickly her first field mission had turned into a nightmare. Above her, the damaged helicopter continued its own descent, while below her lay jagged rocks and what appeared to be certain death. In those terrifying moments of free fall, she had no way of knowing that her survival would depend on a split-second decision made by the very men who had seemingly abandoned her to die. The sensation of falling through the mountain air was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Time seemed to slow down as she tumbled through space, her mind struggling to process the betrayal and terror of the moment. The rocky canyon walls blurred past her as she fell, and the wind tore at her clothing with increasing violence. She tried to scream, but the rushing air seemed to steal the sound from her throat. What Sarah couldn't see, as she plummeted toward what seemed like certain death, was the intense activity taking place in the damaged helicopter above her. Commander Sullivan wasn't abandoning her. He was executing a desperate plan that had been years in the making, a protocol so classified that even Sarah's security clearance hadn't been high enough to know about it. Control, this is Sullivan. Package is deployed. Repeat, package is deployed. He barked into his radio, even as bullets continued to pepper the helicopter's hull. Request immediate Eagle support at grid coordinates 342 to 678. The package was Sarah herself, though she had no way of knowing that her seemingly random assignment to this mission had been anything but coincidental. 3 months earlier, military intelligence had intercepted communications suggesting that Dr. Chin's capture was part of a larger plot to lure American forces into an elaborate trap. Rather than cancel the mission, a decision had been made at the highest levels to turn the tables on the enemy. Sarah's analytical skills and photographic memory made her the perfect candidate for a dangerous gambit. Hidden in her equipment was a sophisticated tracking device, and emergency beacon, technologies so advanced that their very existence was known only to a handful of people in the Pentagon. The plan had always been to get Sarah close enough to the terrorist stronghold to activate the beacon, providing precise coordinates for a massive airstrike that would eliminate the entire cell. The problem was that no one had expected the ambush to happen so quickly or for the helicopter to be damaged so severely. Sullivan had been forced to implement the emergency protocol earlier than planned, literally throwing Sarah into enemy territory with no backup plan and no parachute. As Sarah continued her terrifying descent, her training began to take over despite the overwhelming fear. She forced herself to focus on her body position, remembering emergency procedures she had learned but never expected to use. She spread her arms and legs wide, trying to slow her fall and maintain some semblance of control over her trajectory. Below her, the canyon floor was rapidly approaching, but she began to notice that it wasn't the solid rock surface she had initially thought. There were patches of vegetation, areas where flash floods had deposited sand and debris, and what appeared to be a small stream winding through the bottom of the canyon. If she could somehow maneuver toward the water, she might have a chance of survival, however slim. What Sarah didn't know was that she wasn't falling alone. Approximately 30 seconds after she had been pushed from the helicopter, Commander Sullivan had made another split-second decision that would define his career. Against all protocols and direct orders from his superiors, he had grabbed his parachute and followed her out of the aircraft. Sullivan's decision wasn't born from sentiment or guilt. It was a tactical calculation made by a man who had spent 15 years learning to read impossible situations. He had realized that Sarah's survival was crucial not just to the mission, but to preventing an intelligence disaster that could compromise American operations throughout the region. If she died on impact, the tracking device would be destroyed, and with it, their only chance of locating and eliminating the terrorist cell. As Sullivan deployed his parachute and began his controlled descent, he could see Sarah's figure below him, still falling without any means of slowing her descent. He had perhaps 2 minutes to reach her before she hit the ground, and even with his experience and equipment, the chances of success were minimal at best. The remaining Navy SEALs in the helicopter watched in stunned silence as their commander disappeared into the canyon. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, Sullivan's second-in-command, took control of the situation with grim efficiency. "Change of plans," he announced to the team. "We're going to put this bird down hard and fast. Everyone prepare for emergency landing procedures." The pilot, struggling with damaged controls and failing engines, managed to guide the helicopter toward a relatively flat area of the canyon floor, approximately half a mile from where Sarah had fallen. The landing was violent and chaotic, with metal screeching against rock and equipment flying in all directions, but the crew managed to survive the impact largely intact. Meanwhile, Sarah's fall was beginning to slow slightly as she approached the denser air near the canyon floor. She had managed to angle her descent toward the stream, but she was still falling far too fast to survive a direct impact with the water. Her mind raced through calculations of velocity and impact force, the analytical part of her brain working even in the face of imminent death. It was then that she saw him, a figure with a deployed parachute descending rapidly toward her position. At first, she thought it might be hallucination brought on by terror and oxygen deprivation. But as the figure grew closer, she could make out the familiar silhouette of military gear and the determined face of Commander Sullivan. Sullivan was pushing his parachute to its limits, diving at an angle that would bring him close to Sarah's trajectory. He had released his emergency gear to reduce weight and increase his speed, keeping only the items essential for what he was attempting. In his 15 years of special operations, he had never attempted anything as desperate or unlikely to succeed as what he was about to try. As the two figures converged in the mountain air, Sarah could see Sullivan reaching toward her with one hand while manipulating his parachute controls with the other. The stream below them was getting closer by the second, and she realized that he was trying to position himself to catch her just before impact. The physics of the situation were almost impossible, two bodies falling at different rates, with only one parachute between them, attempting to link up in midair with the ground rushing toward them at deadly speed. Even if Sullivan managed to grab her, there was no guarantee that his parachute could support both of their weights or slow their descent enough to prevent serious injury. But, as Sarah would soon learn, Navy SEALs were trained to succeed in situations where failure seemed certain, and Commander Jake Sullivan had never failed to bring his people home alive. The moment when Sullivan's hand closed around Sarah's wrist was both violent and miraculous. The sudden jerk as her free fall was interrupted sent a shock of pain through her shoulder, but she had never been more grateful for physical discomfort in her life. Above them, Sullivan's parachute strained against the additional weight, the canopy rippling and threatening to collapse under the unexpected load. "Hold on tight," Sullivan shouted over the wind, his grip on her wrist like a steel vise. "This is going to be rough." Sarah wrapped her free arm around Sullivan's legs, clinging to him with desperate strength as they continued their rapid descent toward the canyon floor. The parachute was slowing them down, but not nearly enough. They were still falling far too fast for a safe landing. Sullivan's mind raced through emergency procedures as he fought to control their descent. With one hand gripping Sarah and the other managing the parachute controls, his options were severely limited. The stream below them was their best hope for survival, but even water would feel like concrete at the speed they were traveling. "Listen to me carefully," Sullivan called down to Sarah, his voice calm despite their desperate situation. "When I tell you to let go, you need to release immediately. Don't think about it, just do it. The water is going to hurt, but it's better than the rocks." Sarah's analytical mind rebelled against the idea of voluntarily letting go of her only lifeline, but she forced herself to trust the man who had risked his own life to save her. Below them, the stream was getting larger and deeper as they approached, fed by runoff from the surrounding mountains. At the last possible moment, Sullivan manipulated the parachute controls to create a final burst of lift, trading their remaining altitude for a slight reduction in speed. "Now," he shouted, and Sarah released her grip, dropping the final 15 feet into the ice-cold mountain water. The impact drove the breath from her lungs and sent her tumbling along the rocky streambed, but the water absorbed enough of the force to prevent serious injury. She surfaced gasping and disoriented, just in time to see Sullivan splash down nearby, having cut away from his parachute at the last second to avoid being dragged across the rocks. For several moments, both of them simply lay in the shallow water, breathing hard and trying to process the fact that they were still alive. Sarah's body ached from head to toe, and she could taste blood in her mouth, but she was conscious and mobile, a miracle considering what she had just survived. "Are you hurt?" Sullivan asked, pulling himself to his feet and scanning the canyon walls for signs of enemy movement. Even in their moment of survival, his training kept him focused on the tactical situation. "I think I'm okay," Sarah replied, testing her arms and legs for serious injury. "Bruised and battered, but nothing seems broken." Sullivan helped her to her feet and quickly led her toward a cluster of large boulders that would provide cover from observation. As they took shelter, he activated a small device from his equipment pack, an emergency communicator that would signal their position to any friendly forces in the area. "What the hell just happened up there?" Sarah demanded, her shock beginning to give way to anger. "Why did you push me out of the helicopter? I thought you were trying to kill me." Sullivan's expression was grim as he checked his weapons and remaining equipment. "I'm sorry about that. There wasn't time to explain, and honestly, there still isn't. That was an emergency protocol that I hoped we'd never have to use." "Emergency protocol for what? Murdering your own people?" "For surviving a compromised mission and completing the objective despite impossible odds," Sullivan replied curtly. "Your equipment pack contains more than just intelligence gear, Sarah. You're carrying a beacon that can call in precision airstrikes, and right now, you might be the only thing standing between that terrorist cell and a lot of dead Americans." Sarah looked down at her equipment pack, which had somehow remained attached during her fall. She had thought it contained only computers and communication devices, but now she was beginning to understand that her role in this mission had been more complex than she had been told. "You mean I'm bait?" she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "You're a highly trained intelligence analyst carrying the most advanced tracking technology the military has ever developed," Sullivan corrected. "And, right now, we need to get close enough to that terrorist compound to activate it." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of voices echoing through the canyon. Looking up, they could see armed figures rappelling down the canyon walls, moving with the efficiency of trained soldiers. The terrorist cell had apparently survived the helicopter crash and was now searching for survivors. "Time to move," Sullivan whispered, checking his rifle and adjusting his pack. "We need to find cover and figure out our next move." As they began to make their way through the rocky terrain, staying low and using whatever cover they could find, Sarah's mind raced with questions and realizations. The mission had been compromised from the beginning, but somehow that had been anticipated and planned for. Her supposed random assignment to a field operation had been anything but random. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly as they paused behind a large boulder to check for pursuit. "Known what?" "That this was a setup. That we were walking into a trap." Sullivan was quiet for a moment before answering. "Intelligence suggested it was a possibility. The decision was made at levels far above my pay grade to proceed anyway and use it to our advantage. And my role? Your analytical skills, your memory, and your security clearance made you the perfect person to carry the beacon into enemy territory. The idea was that you'd never have to know about it. The helicopter would drop the team, you do your analysis work from a safe distance, and the beacon would be activated remotely." Sarah felt a surge of anger at the deception, but she forced herself to focus on their immediate situation. They could hear their pursuers getting closer, and the sound of helicopters in the distance suggested that reinforcements were on the way, though whether those reinforcements were friendly or hostile remained to be seen. "So what's the plan now?" she asked. Sullivan pointed toward a narrow passage between two rock formations that led deeper into the canyon. "We make our way to the terrorist compound, activate your beacon, and hope that our backup arrives before we're completely overwhelmed." "That sounds like a terrible plan." "It is," Sullivan admitted with a slight smile. "But Navy SEALs specialize in making terrible plans work. And besides, after what we just survived, how much worse can it get?" As if in answer to his question, the sound of barking dogs echoed through the canyon, and Sarah realized that their pursuers were using tracking animals to follow their scent. Their luck, it seemed, was about to be tested once again. The sound of barking grew steadily louder as Sarah and Sullivan made their way through the narrow canyon passage. The rocky walls on either side of them rose nearly vertical, creating a natural corridor that offered both concealment and the terrifying possibility of being trapped with no escape route. "Dogs change everything," Sullivan muttered, checking his remaining ammunition. "We can hide from people, but trained tracking dogs will follow our scent no matter what we do." Sarah's analytical mind kicked into gear, processing their tactical situation with the same methodical approach she used for intelligence work. "The stream we landed in flows through this whole canyon system. If we can get back to running water, it might disrupt our scent trail." Sullivan nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. But first we need to put some distance between us and our friends back there." They pressed forward through the passage, moving as quickly as they dared while trying to minimize noise. The canyon floor was littered with loose rocks that shifted underfoot, and more than once they had to freeze in place as the sound of voices echoed off the surrounding walls. After 20 minutes of careful progress, they emerged into a wider section of the canyon where the stream reappeared, flowing around a series of large boulders that had tumbled from the walls above. The water was deeper here, almost knee-deep in places, and moving fast enough to create a constant background noise that would help mask their movements. "This is perfect," Sullivan said, stepping into the water. "We can follow this upstream toward the compound while staying in the water to confuse the tracking dogs." As they waded through the cold mountain stream, Sarah finally had a chance to ask the questions that had been burning in her mind since their dramatic escape from the helicopter. "The rest of your team," she said quietly, "are they alive?" Sullivan's expression grew somber. "Rodriguez is tough, and he had good men with him. If anyone could survive that crash landing, it would be them. But I won't lie to you. Our chances of getting out of here alive just got a lot worse without their support. Why did you come after me? You could have stayed with your team and had a much better chance of survival." Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, concentrating on navigating around a fallen tree that partially blocked the stream. When he finally answered, his voice carried the weight of years of command decisions. 15 years ago, I made a promise to myself that I would never leave anyone behind. Not ever. But beyond that, your beacon is our only chance of completing this mission and preventing something much worse from happening." What could be worse than this? The terrorist cell that captured Dr. Chen isn't just holding him for ransom or propaganda. Intelligence suggests they're forcing him to work on weaponizing his water purification technology. If they succeed, they'll have the ability to poison water supplies in major cities. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold mountain water. The implications of weaponized water treatment technology were staggering. Millions of people could be killed without warning, and the attack could be carried out by anyone with access to a municipal water system. How close do we need to get to activate the beacon? Within 500 meters of the compound. The signal needs to penetrate underground installations, so we need to be fairly close for it to work properly. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of helicopters approaching from multiple directions. Looking up through the narrow opening between the canyon walls, they could see aircraft circling overhead, too high to identify whether they were friendly or hostile. "Could be backup," Sullivan said hopefully, but his expression suggested he wasn't optimistic. "Or more enemies," Sarah added, voicing what they were both thinking. The sound of the helicopters was soon joined by another ominous noise. The barking of dogs was getting closer, despite their efforts to disrupt the scent trail by staying in the water. The tracking animals were apparently more skilled than they had hoped. "We need to pick up the pace," Sullivan said, checking his watch. "If those are enemy reinforcements overhead, we're going to be facing a lot more opposition than just a few guys with dogs." They increased their speed, splashing through the stream as quickly as they dared while trying to maintain stealth. The canyon was beginning to open up ahead of them, and Sullivan used his binoculars to scout the terrain they would need to cross. "There," he said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings visible in the distance. "That's got to be the compound. Maybe 2 kilometers from our current position." Sarah studied the target through her own binoculars. The compound consisted of several low buildings built into the natural rock formations, with what appeared to be guard towers and defensive positions scattered around the perimeter. It looked more like a military installation than the simple hideout she had been expecting. That's a lot bigger than the intelligence report suggested, she observed. Which means there are probably a lot more people inside than we planned for, Sullivan replied grimly. But we stick to the mission. Get within 500 meters, activate the beacon, and hope that whatever's circling overhead up there is on our side. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the stream and cross open ground toward the compound, the sound of gunfire erupted behind them. Someone was shooting at something, though whether it was their pursuers firing at shadows or an actual firefight was impossible to determine from their position. That could be Rodriguez and the team, Sullivan said with hope in his voice for the first time since their ordeal began. If they survive the crash and are engaging the enemy, it might give us the distraction we need to reach the compound. Sarah activated her equipment pack and began running diagnostics on the beacon device. Following procedures that had been embedded in her memory during weeks of training she had thought was just routine security preparation. Now she realized that every aspect of her assignment had been carefully planned and choreographed. The beacon is operational, she reported. All I need to do is enter the activation code when we're in range. Do you remember the code? Sarah smiled grimly. I remember everything. Photographic memory, remember? It's why they chose me for this. As they began their approach toward the compound, staying low and using whatever cover the rocky terrain provided, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how completely her life had changed in the span of a few hours. This morning she had been a desk analyst excited about her first field assignment. Now she was creeping through enemy territory carrying technology that could determine the outcome of a major counterterrorism operation. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very skills that had made her valuable as an intelligence analyst, her ability to see patterns, remember details, and analyze complex situations, were now the only things keeping her alive in a situation no amount of training could have truly prepared her for. But, as they drew closer to their target, Sarah realized that the most dangerous part of their mission was just beginning. The final approach to the terrorist compound required crossing nearly half a mile of open ground with minimal cover. Sarah and Sullivan moved from rock to rock, using every shadow and depression in the terrain to avoid detection by the guards they could see patrolling the perimeter. The compound was indeed much larger than intelligence had suggested, with multiple levels built into the mountainside, and what appeared to be extensive underground facilities. 500 meters, Sullivan whispered, checking the GPS coordinates on his device. We're in range. You can activate the beacon. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she accessed the hidden controls in her equipment pack. Everything they had been through, all the risks and sacrifices, came down to this moment. She entered the activation code from memory, her fingers moving automatically through the complex sequence that would call down destruction on the compound below. Beacon active, she reported quietly. Signal is transmitting. How long before the airstrike arrives? The briefing said 15 to 20 minutes from activation, Sarah replied, checking the device's status display. Assuming there are assets in range to respond. Their answer came almost immediately, in the form of radio chatter from the compound below. Even at their distance, they could hear shouting and alarm bells as the terrorist cell realized they were under some form of electronic surveillance. Whatever jamming equipment they had been using to block communications was apparently ineffective against Sarah's advanced beacon. They know something's up, Sullivan observed, watching through his binoculars as armed figures began emerging from the underground portions of the compound. We need to find better cover and prepare for company. As they looked for a more defensible position, the sound of helicopters returned, much closer this time. Looking up, Sarah could see military aircraft approaching from multiple directions, flying in formation with the purposeful movement of a coordinated assault. Those are ours, Sullivan said with relief evident in his voice. Looks like the cavalry is finally arriving. But their celebration was short-lived. The terrorist cell had apparently been preparing for exactly this scenario, because surface-to-air missiles began streaking toward the incoming helicopters. The sky above the canyon erupted in a chaotic aerial battle as military aircraft attempted to avoid the defensive fire while positioning themselves for an assault on the compound. We need to get Dr. Chen out of there before this place gets leveled, Sullivan realized, his tactical mind already working on the problem. If he's underground when the airstrike hits, he might not survive. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. You want to go down there? into the middle of a terrorist compound that's about to be bombed. It's what we came here to do, Sullivan replied simply. The beacon was just the first part of the mission. Getting the scientist out alive was always the primary objective. As if to emphasize the urgency of the situation, explosions began erupting around the compound as the first wave of airstrikes found their targets. The terrorist cell was putting up fierce resistance, but it was clear that they were outmatched by the coordinated military assault. Sullivan checked his remaining ammunition and equipment, then looked at Sarah with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the same determined focus he had shown when he jumped out of the helicopter to save her life. I need you to stay here and monitor the beacon, he said. If anything happens to me, you'll need to guide the rescue teams to Dr. Chin's location. No, Sarah said firmly. I'm not staying behind while you go down there alone. We started this together, and we're going to finish it together. Sullivan started to argue, but Sarah cut him off. I'm the intelligence analyst, remember? If Dr. Chun is being held underground, I'm the one most likely to figure out where based on the compound's layout and the intelligence we have about their operations. He stared at her for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but we do this fast, and we do it smart. The airstrike is going to level this place in 10 minutes whether we're clear or not. They began their descent toward the compound, using the chaos of the aerial battle as cover for their approach. Smoke and debris filled the air as explosions rocked the facility, and they could see terrorist fighters running in all directions, some trying to escape and others attempting to maintain defensive positions. Sarah's analytical mind cataloged every detail as they moved closer to the buildings. The layout of the compound, the positioning of the defensive structures, the apparent age and construction methods of the various buildings, all of it formed a pattern that helped her understand how the facility was organized. There, she said, pointing toward a partially concealed entrance built into the natural rock face. That's where they'd keep a high-value prisoner. It's defensible, hidden from aerial observation, and close enough to the main buildings for easy access. Sullivan nodded approvingly. Good eye. Let's move. They reached the entrance just as a massive explosion rocked the compound's main building. The terrorist cell's ammunition depot had apparently been hit, sending a fireball hundreds of feet into the air and showering the area with burning debris. The underground entrance was guarded by two fighters who were more concerned with the aerial assault than with watching for ground-based infiltration. Sullivan moved with the fluid efficiency of 15 years of special operations training, neutralizing both guards before they had a chance to raise an alarm. Inside the underground facility, they found a maze of tunnels and chambers carved directly into the mountain rock. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the sound of explosions from above echoed through the passages like distant thunder. Dr. Chun, Sarah called out as they moved through the tunnels, her voice echoing off the stone walls. Dr. Chun, we're here to get you out. A weak voice answered from somewhere deeper in the complex. Here. I'm here. They followed the voice through several turns until they found a heavy metal door secured with multiple locks. Inside, they discovered Dr. James Chun, alive, but obviously weakened by weeks of captivity. The 50-year-old scientist looked up at them with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Are you real? He asked, his voice hoarse from dehydration. I thought I was hallucinating. We're real, and we're getting you out of here, Sullivan assured him, working to break the locks on the door. Can you walk? I think so, Dr. Chun replied, struggling to his feet with Sarah's help. They've been forcing me to work on their project, but I've been sabotaging the process as much as I could without them realizing it. As they helped Dr. Chun toward the tunnel exit, the facility shook with another massive explosion, this one much closer than the previous ones. Dust and small rocks rained down from the ceiling, and they could hear the sound of structural collapse somewhere in the complex. Time to go, Sullivan announced, supporting Dr. Chun as they moved as quickly as possible toward the exit. This whole place is coming down. They emerged from the underground facility into a scene of complete devastation. The compound was largely destroyed, with fires burning in multiple locations, and the remaining terrorist fighters either dead or fleeing into the surrounding mountains. Military helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, and Sarah could see ground troops beginning to secure the area. Beacon deactivated, Sarah reported, shutting down her device now that the mission was complete. Target neutralized. As military medics rushed forward to assist Dr. Chun, and Sarah finally allowed herself to believe that they had actually survived their ordeal, she looked over at Commander Sullivan. The man who had thrown her out of a helicopter without a parachute, then jumped after her to ensure her survival, was already coordinating with the arriving ground forces and planning the extraction. "You know," she said to him during a brief quiet moment, "when I signed up for field work, this wasn't exactly what I had in mind." Sullivan smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since the mission began. "Navy SEALs always stick the landing," he replied, "even when there's no place to land." 3 weeks later, as Sarah sat in a secure briefing room receiving a commendation for her role in the successful rescue of Dr. Chun and the destruction of the terrorist cell's weapons program, she reflected on how much her life had changed. She was no longer just an intelligence analyst content to work behind the scenes. She was a field operative who had proven herself under impossible conditions. The official report would never mention the full details of what happened in that Afghan canyon. But Sarah knew that she had been part of something extraordinary. She had been thrown from a helicopter without a parachute by the very man who then risked everything to save her life. Together, they had completed a mission that seemed impossible and proved that sometimes the most desperate plans can succeed when executed by people who refuse to accept failure as an option. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew that this was probably just the beginning of a very different kind of career than she had originally planned. After all, once you've survived being pushed out of a helicopter by a Navy SEAL, desk work starts to seem a little bit boring.